Welcome to a short introductory video to Expense at Work. Expense at Work is an expense management system. It's built on a multi-company, multi-currency, and multi-language framework, but it can also be used by one company in one language and in one currency. I'm going to log in as a typical user. As David Brown, I can create and submit a number of different form types. You can actually configure the system to hold as many form types as you wish, with different workflow, different calculations, and different entry fields. Typically in an expense system you might have these: a cash advance, foreign or local expenses, although you may combine those. In this demonstration database I've also got an extra form which can illustrate the way in which mileage can be automatically calculated, or distances can be calculated between postcodes and locations, but we'll look at that later. And in some cases companies also want a travel request form so that expenses are in effect pre-authorized. Let's look at some forms that I've partially filled in already. First of all, let's look at a simple local expense form. Now, almost every company is different in terms of the fields they want to capture, and this demonstration database is just one particular configuration. We might have a short description that explains what these expenses are for. In this case, a trip to London, where there's accommodation, some driving involved, and a daily allowance. I've chosen these three different types because they each trigger the entry of different fields. The accommodation expense type requires a description. We might also attach an image of the receipt or the invoice that the hotel has produced. And in this case as well, on the first row, we enter the local currency value. And we can see that David Brown will be reimbursed £100. On the second row, we've chosen expense type miles or kilometers. And in this case, a different field was made enterable. And the system has gone away and looked up the mileage rate and calculated a reimbursable value. In the third case, we've chosen allowances. And here the system has calculated the number of days or nights between the departure time and the return time, and has then calculated 1 day allowance of £25. Now, as I said, this is just one configuration of the system. It can be configured in all sorts of different ways, and of course mileage rates and allowance rates are variable from one country to another, and in some countries there is no such thing as a daily allowance. When a form is completed by an individual, he or she will submit it, and the form might then be sent to his line manager for review. This is going to Madeleine Dax. Madeleine Dax will get an email telling her that she has work to do in authorizing this form. She will log in and we'll see that there is a form to authorize. She may then open that form, might decide to return the entire form to David Brown, might decide to return just one row using the partial return function, or might decide that the form is satisfactory and authorize it. Now at this point the form will go to Susan Davis for review. She also will get an email. She will log in and see that there is a form for her to review. She will open this form and at this point, in the way it's configured here, she may opt to enter a tax value if there is some VAT or other tax reclaimable from the hotel invoice. And if she's satisfied with the entire form, she will click the Reviewed button, and the form will then be posted to what we call the expenses ledger from which it will in due course also go across to an accounting system with all the proper accounts set. Now that was a fairly simple workflow involving just 3 steps, but you can have up to 22 different steps in the workflow. Why would you do that? Well, perhaps if a form exceeds a certain value, then it will go to a finance director for additional authorization. Or if there is an expense of a particular type or a particular cost center is used, it might go to yet another individual. Nobody would use all 22, but it gives you some flexibility. Let's log out and log back in again as David Brown and briefly look at the other forms that he has at his disposal. Here, for example, we have an Amex statement. Expense at Work enables the import of electronic bank statements from Amex or any other bank. And in this case, the data are presented to a user, such as David Brown, but he cannot change the notes or the values. All he must do is to assign an expense type. Here again, it might be a hotel. He might decide that some of that expense actually belongs to a different cost center. He can't alter the value in the form or the row, but he can split it. So he might split that, in this case, just one way, because there is an option to split it as many ways as possible. Let's split it by just 20% of that. It's going to be split into another row. And he may then decide to override the default cost center, which would be his own, and charge this one, for example, to research. So that's what the processing of a credit card form might look like. Once submitted, the form will go through the same kind of workflow that we saw before, or different depending on how you've configured it. A foreign expense form, and actually of course you could combine your local and your foreign expenses, will be very similar as well, except that in this case, when David Brown enters the total value, he may also choose a currency code, and note that the most recent currency codes that he has used are listed first. There are a variety of options for handling exchange rates. In this particular configuration, he has an option to override the exchange rate that is held and offered by the system. But sometimes exchange rates are fixed. And again, when this is submitted, it can go through the same or different workflow. Finally, just to illustrate the way in which web services can be used by Expense at Work, we have a specially configured form type here where you can enter in, for example, a postcode from W112EF to SP27UX, which is in Salisbury, from London to Salisbury. I click on that, and the system will go away to a Microsoft web service and find the distance. I could put in something like New York to Chicago. And in this case it calculates 925 miles. I hope that's correct. And so those are the kinds of forms that we can have in the system. An employee can have a number of reports on his or her expenses, can see forms that are in progress. So here, for example, David Brown can see that his forms are currently actually in his own inbox, as it were, but he could see whether a form is waiting for the approval of a particular person or for review. And if I log in as a manager, we can see that a larger selection of reports is available. This is a typical grid report. If I run this, it will list every expense in the system. And I can sort these and sort them by clicking on a column header, or filter, or group them together by clicking on the little plus box there. And then I see them summarized. I can export them to Excel or group them in various different ways. Once the data are in the system, it's easy to get them out. And there are many other kinds of report as well, including graphical reports and reports such as these, which show a simple grid of types of expense and how much has been incurred in a particular month. The reporting possibilities are unlimited. It's all configured. And when rendering reports, for graphical reports, we're using either Crystal Reports or Microsoft Reporting Services. So that's Expense at Work in brief. Thank you for listening.